They told her the land was dead. They told her to sell, to leave, to stop embarrassing herself. A widow with 2 small children and a cracked, dry homestead in the middle of nowhere. What chance did she have? Garrick Voss, the most powerful man in 3 counties, had already written her off. The whole town of Ash Hollow had. But Brenna Holloway picked up a shovel anyway. What she dug next would either bury her completely or change the prairie forever. If you love stories about women who refuse to quit, hit like right now. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The wagon seat was hard and the road was worse, and Brenna Holloway had been telling herself for the last 4 hours that she was not going to cry. She hadn't cried at the funeral. She hadn't cried when the bank man came to the door in Moline with his hat in his hands and a very polite way of explaining that Thomas had taken out a second lien against the house without telling her. She hadn't cried when she sold the furniture, the settee her mother had given her, the rocking chair Thomas used to sit in on Sunday mornings with his coffee going cold beside him because he kept forgetting to drink it while he read. She had not cried through any of it. She wasn't about to cry now, staring at 120 acres of cracked Nebraska earth that looked like the surface of the moon if the moon had also decided to give up. Eli sat beside her on the bench with his arms folded across his chest, the way boys do when they're trying to look older than they are. He was 9 and already too serious, and he kept scanning the land with narrowed eyes like he was doing math. Tessa was asleep in the wagon bed behind them, one arm thrown over the family's old water pail, her mouth slightly open. "Is this it?" Eli said. "This is it." "It looks like it's been on fire." "It hasn't been on fire," Brenna said. "It's just dry. There's no creek." She had noticed. The papers from Thomas's brother had mentioned a seasonal creek along the eastern edge of the property. There was indeed a creek bed. She could see the shallow depression cutting across the far corner of the land, but the creek itself had apparently decided it was done for the season, or maybe longer. The stones in the bed were bleached white, and there wasn't a dark patch of moisture anywhere along it. "The creek runs in spring," Brenna said, and she said it with more certainty than she felt. Eli looked at her sidelong. He had Thomas's eyes, that direct, patient look that never quite let her get away with anything. "It's April." "I know what month it is, Eli." She climbed down from the wagon, and her boots hit the ground, and a little puff of pale dust rose up around her feet. The grass, what was left of it, was the color of old straw. She walked 10 paces out and crouched down and pressed her hand flat against the soil. It was hard, not just surface dry, the kind of crust you could break through with a finger and find moisture underneath. This was hard all the way down, the kind of ground that had been baking for months. She stood up and looked at the house. The word house was generous. It was a soddy, a low structure built from blocks of cut sod, with 2 small windows and a door that was hanging slightly crooked on its leather hinges. The roof was a combination of wooden poles and more sod. There was a lean-to on the south side that would serve as shelter for the horse. There was a hand pump near the door that Brenna had already guessed, from the looks of the dry spout, was not going to work without significant coaxing. "It's small," Eli said. He had climbed down too and was standing beside her. "We'll manage." "There's no well." "There's a pump. Doesn't look like it works." "Eli." She turned and looked at him directly. "I know. I can see the same things you can see, but we are here, and this land belongs to us, and we are going to figure it out. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Behind them, Tessa woke up from the wagon with a sharp little snort and immediately said, "Are we there? Is this the farm? Can I get down?" Sette. They spent that first afternoon doing what settlers always do, unpacking what they had and taking inventory of what they didn't. The inventory of what they didn't have was considerably longer than the inventory of what they did. They had the wagon, the horse, a bay gelding named Duncan, who was 15 years old and had opinions about everything, 2 trunks of clothing and household items, a crate of dry goods, a cast iron skillet, a Dutch oven, 3 blankets, and a box of miscellaneous things that Brenna had grabbed from the Malone house without fully looking through it. That box would matter later, but she didn't know that yet. The pump was indeed broken, but not unfixably so. One of the leather seals had dried and cracked. Brenna found a piece of harness leather in the lean-to and fashioned a temporary replacement while Eli held the lantern and Tessa sat on a fence post asking questions about everything. By the time the light was going, water was coming up, thin and slightly brown and tasting of minerals, but water. They ate cold biscuits and dried beef in the soddy with the door propped open to let in the last of the daylight. The walls smelled of earth. The ceiling was low. A spider had built an elaborate web in the corner above the window, and Tessa was very interested in it. "Can I keep it?" she said. "No." "Why not?" "Because it will attract more spiders." "I like spiders." "Tessa." "I'm just saying." Brenna found the stub of a candle in her trunk and lit it. She sat at the small table, the only piece of furniture the previous occupant had left behind, and spread out the land papers and what she could remember of what Thomas's brother had written before he died. Jacob Holloway had claimed this land 3 years prior and done almost nothing with it before a horse accident ended things. The claim was valid, and the title had transferred cleanly. That, at least, was something. 120 acres. Soil that might be decent if there was any water to work with. A dry year. Everyone she'd spoken to in the last 100 miles had said the same thing. Dry year. Might break. Might not. She sat there after the children were asleep and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding. She had enough money to last through the summer if she was very careful. She needed to plant something. Needed to plant a lot of something. And she needed water to do it, and the pump was giving her enough for the household, but not nearly enough for any real acreage of crops. She didn't sleep much that night. The town of Ash Hollow was 4 miles east, straddling the main road like it wasn't quite sure whether to become a real town or give up and disperse. It had a general store, a feed store, a post office, a livery, a saloon, and a church, which covered most of the things a frontier settlement needed. It also had the particular social atmosphere that small isolated towns develop, a dense web of history and opinion and judgment that visitors walked into without knowing it. Brenna drove the wagon in 3 days after arriving, with Tessa beside her and Eli in the back, and she felt every set of eyes on the main street track them as they passed. The general store was run by a man named Clem Purcell, who was about 60 and had the careful, neutral expression of a man who'd survived in business by never committing to an opinion where anyone could hear him. He measured out her flour and coffee and salt with practiced efficiency. "You're the Holloway widow," he said. Not a question. "Brenna Holloway, yes." "The Jacob Holloway claim." "That's right." He set the sack of flour on the counter and looked at her with that careful, neutral expression. "Tough piece of land. Jacob never did much with it. Jacob died. Before that, too." He paused. "You planning to farm it?" "I am." Something passed across his face. Not quite pity, not quite amusement. "You got people? Help?" "My children." "Your children," he said. He looked at Eli, who was examining a display of pocket knives with studied casualness, and at Tessa, who had her hands pressed against the glass of the candy case. "That one's what, 6? 6.5, Tessa said, without looking up from the candy. "Well," Clem said. He picked up the next item on Brenna's list and didn't say anything else. She heard the rest of it outside through the open door of the feed store where she went next. 2 men talking around the corner, not bothering to lower their voices particularly. "Holloway widow, from Illinois." "That dried-up claim east of the ridge? What's she going to do with that?" "Not a thing. Same as Jacob. She'll make it through spring, maybe, then Voss will buy her out." He offered Jacob twice, wouldn't sell. Jacob was stubborn. She's a widow woman with 2 kids. Different calculation. Brenna walked around the corner, and both men looked at her. They were farmers, mid-40s, weathered and solid. They had the grace to look mildly uncomfortable. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "Ma'am," said one. "Morning," said the other. She went back to her wagon. Garrick Voss came to her property on a Thursday, which was 11 days after she arrived. She knew who he was before he introduced himself. She'd heard his name enough times already to recognize the shape of his significance in the county. He owned the Voss Ranch, which ran some 4,000 acres south and west of Ash Hollow. He'd bought and absorbed a half-dozen smaller claims over the years. He was the kind of man that small towns produce as a natural consequence of geography and ambition, someone with enough land and enough capital to have made himself indispensable to the local economy, which gave him a degree of influence that he'd never had to be crude about exercising. He didn't need to be. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a close-cropped gray beard and eyes that were pale and assessing. He rode a good horse. His clothes were well made without being showy. He had, Brenna thought, the specific confidence of a man who had not been told no very many times in recent memory. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm Garrick Voss. I have land adjacent to your eastern boundary." "I know who you are," Brenna said. She was standing at the pump, and she didn't move toward him. He smiled slightly. "Word travels." "It does." He looked around at the property with the particular survey of a man assessing an asset. His eyes went to the dry creek bed, to the hard-packed soil, to the house. "I'll come directly to it," he said. "I've been meaning to acquire this parcel for some time. Jacob wouldn't sell. I understand that. But you're in a different position than Jacob was, and I'd like to make you a fair offer." "What's the offer?" He named a number. It was not a fair offer. It was the kind of offer that was calibrated to sound reasonable while being significantly below the land's potential value. But more importantly, it was the kind of offer that was calibrated to a widow with no money and no prospects. An offer that said, "I know your situation, and I'm counting on it." Brenna looked at him steadily. "No," he paused. "Mrs. Holloway, I don't think you have a clear picture of what you're facing here. It's been a dry year. The soil on this claim hasn't been worked properly in 3 years. You have no—" "I have a clear picture," she said. "The answer is no." A longer pause this time. He recalibrated visibly, and she could see him reassigning her from one category to another in his head. "I'll leave the offer open," he said, "in case your thinking changes." "It won't." He tipped his hat again and rode out. Brenna watched him go. Her hands were completely steady. She was somewhat surprised by that. She found the notebook on a Sunday, 3 weeks after arriving. She had finally gotten around to going through the miscellaneous box, the one she'd grabbed without looking from the Milan house. It held the expected detritus: a broken watch, a spool of thread, a child's wooden horse that had been Eli's when he was small, 2 letters from Thomas's mother that Brenna had already read, a pocket Bible, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, a small notebook. It was old. The cover was soft leather, cracked at the spine, and the pages inside were close written in a hand she didn't recognize at first, and then did. It was Thomas's father, Walter Holloway. She had met him twice before he died years ago. He'd been a farmer his whole life, Illinois and before that Missouri, and before that somewhere in Kentucky. She sat at the table and read it. Most of it was ordinary enough. Planting records, weather observations, notes on seed varieties. But there was a section in the middle, maybe 20 pages, that was different. Walter had apparently become interested late in his life in what he called dry ground methods, techniques for farming in low water conditions. He had corresponded with someone, a man whose name appeared only as F. Crane, who had farmed in arid country and developed a set of practices for capturing and holding whatever water did come. Brenna read it slowly, twice. One technique in particular kept drawing her back. Crane's method involved cutting a wide, curved trench across the slope of a property, not to drain water away, but to catch it. The curve was important. The depth was important. Done correctly, a heavy rain that would normally run off across the surface and disappear would instead fill the trench, slow down, and gradually seep downward into the soil rather than evaporating or washing away. The water would stay in the ground weeks longer than it would otherwise. Crops planted below the trench would have access to that reservoir. There were pages of notes, measurements, angles. The specific curvature required based on slope gradient. Crane had apparently done this on a property in Kansas and produced crops through 2 consecutive dry summers that had devastated neighboring farms. Brenna closed the notebook and sat with it in her hands for a long time. Then she went outside and started walking the property. She spent 3 days walking it before she said anything to anyone. She walked with Walter's notebook, and she walked with her eyes on the ground, reading the slope, reading the drainage patterns, the old marks where water had run during past rains, the slight depressions and rises that told the story of how this land moved. The slope ran northwest to southeast. The best position for the trench, based on Crane's notes, would be a long curve across the midsection of the property. Perhaps 180 yards of it, angled to catch the runoff from the high ground to the northwest, and hold it before it could drain away toward the dry creek. The problem, the significant problem, was the work involved. Crane's notes were honest about this. The trench needed to be at least 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide to hold any meaningful volume. On 180 yards, that was an enormous amount of digging. For one woman and one 9-year-old boy working with hand tools, it was a great deal of digging. She also knew, even before she told anyone, what the reaction would be. She had already developed a clear enough picture of Ash Hollow's opinion of her prospects. Anything she did that wasn't immediately conventional would be received as evidence of foolishness. She told Eli first, because he was her partner in the enterprise, whether either of them had chosen it. She spread Crane's notes on the table and walked him through it. He listened the way he always listened, seriously, without interrupting, tracking each piece of the explanation. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "How long would it take to dig?" he said. "Weeks, maybe more. And we wouldn't be planting during that time." "No." He looked at the notes. "Everyone plants in May." "I know." "They'll think—" "I know what they'll think, Eli." He looked up at her. "But you think this will work?" "I think it might work. I think it's the best chance we have, given what we're working with. A well would cost more than we have. We can't irrigate from the pump. Without water, anything I plant will burn up in July." She paused. "The notebook says it worked in Kansas." "Kansas," he said. "The soil conditions are similar. The slope is right. I've walked it." He nodded slowly, that old man in a boy's body nod. "All right," he said. "When do we start?" They started on the second Monday of May, which was the same week that every other farmer in the county was putting seed in the ground. Brenna had marked the trench line with stakes and string, a gentle curve that followed the contour of the slope, running from a point near the northwest fence line all the way down to a natural low spot near the center of the property. The curve was the key thing. Crane had been very specific. A straight trench would fill unevenly. The curve slowed the water and distributed it along the length of the channel. The soil was hard. The first day, they broke 2 wooden handles on the digging tools, and Brenna's palms were raw and blistered by afternoon. She wrapped them in cloth and kept going. Eli dug beside her without complaint, though she could see by the set of his jaw that he was hurting too. Tessa was assigned to carry water from the pump and to pile the excavated soil on the downhill side of the trench. This was important, Crane had noted, because the soil berm would itself help hold captured water in place. They made perhaps 12 feet of progress that first day. Brenna did the math that evening and did not share it with the children. By the end of the first week, they had roughly 40 feet of trench and the kind of tiredness that sits in the bones rather than the muscles. Duncan the horse had been watching them from the lean-to with what Brenna could only describe as a skeptical expression. Word had gotten around. It always did. She went to the feed store on Saturday to pick up supplies, and the man behind the counter, his name was Higgins, and he had the particular social bravery of men who are confident they will not be disagreed with, looked at her with open amusement. "Here you're digging yourself a ditch," he said. "That's right." "What for?" "Water capture." He considered this. Most folks, they want water, they drill a well. "I can't afford a well." "Might be cheaper in the long run than spending 2 weeks digging a ditch that might not do a thing." "It might be," Brenna said. "When you have a well driller to recommend who'll work for promises, let me know." He laughed, and not kindly. She took her supplies and left. The following week, 2 farmers she didn't know rode by while they were working. They slowed their horses and watched for a minute. She could hear them talking, Misa, not the words, just the tone, which was the tone of people confirming an existing opinion. One of them called out, "You know you're delaying your whole planting season?" "I do," she said, without stopping. "Won't be anything left to plant by the time you're done." "There will be," she said. They rode on. The third week, a woman came. Her name was May Decker, and she farmed, or rather, she and her husband Carl farmed, the claim directly north of Brenna's. She was perhaps 40, a compact and practical woman with rough hands and a direct manner of speaking. She brought a covered dish of something that smelled like beans and cornbread and set it on the wagon gate without ceremony. "Carl says you're wasting your time," she said. "I don't know about that, but either way, you've got kids to feed." Brenna straightened up from the trench. "Thank you, Mrs. Decker." "May." She looked at the trench line. They were perhaps a third of the way along now, maybe 60 feet in. The berm of excavated soil ran alongside it, 3 feet high in some places. "What is that exactly?" Brenna explained it. May listened in the same direct way she spoke, without theatrics. When Brenna was done, May was quiet a moment. "Where'd you learn that?" "A notebook. My father-in-law's. He corresponded with a man in Kansas who'd done it." "Kansas?" May said with the same tone Eli had used. "I know," Brenna said. May looked at the trench again. "Carl thinks—" She stopped. "Carl thinks a lot of things. I don't always agree with him." She looked at Brenna directly. "My husband's got a mule that isn't doing much right now. If you want to use it for a few days for the digging, I won't tell him it was my idea." Brenna stared at her. "Pride doesn't water crops," May said simply. "No," Brenna agreed. "It doesn't. Thank you." The mule's name was Jasper, and he had a worse temperament than Duncan, but he could pull a breaking plow, and with a breaking plow, the digging went 3 times as fast. By the end of that week, they had cleared almost 100 feet of trench. The berm was taking shape, a long, curving earthwork that cut across the property like a scar that might, Brenna thought, become something else. She had a conversation she hadn't expected with Clem Purcell at the general store in the 5th week. She was loading her wagon, and he came out and stood near the back of it. And it was clear he wanted to say something without being seen to say something, which was his particular social difficulty. "Mrs. Holloway," he finally started. "Clem? That trench you're digging." He paused. "I've been hearing about it. I imagine. People think, I know what people think." He was quiet a moment. "I knew a man once," he said, and stopped again, and Brenna waited. "Neighbor of my father's. This was back in Missouri. He had a piece of low ground that flooded every spring. Everybody thought the land was worthless. He spent a whole summer moving dirt around. His wife thought he'd lost his mind." Clem paused. "Ended up he'd built something, redirected the drainage. That low ground became the best soil in the county." Brenna looked at him. "I'm not saying your thing will work," he said quickly, retreating back into neutrality. "I'm just saying, sometimes the people moving dirt aren't crazy." "Sometimes," she agreed. He went back inside. She drove home. In the 6th week of digging, they hit something. Eli was working the far end of the trench. They were nearly complete now, perhaps 20 feet left, and he called out to her in a voice that was trying not to be excited and failing. "Mama, come look at this." She walked to him. He was standing at the bottom of the trench, which was about 2.5 feet down at this point, and the soil at his feet was a different color than the soil above it, darker, almost gray. She crouched and pressed her hand into it. Wet. Not damp, wet. The kind of wet that meant water, somewhere beneath it. She looked at Eli. He was looking back at her. "Is that—" he started. "Get the longer spade," she said. They dug another 18 inches. Water began seeping in along the base of the trench from the southeast very slowly, finding the channel they'd opened and working its way in. It wasn't much. It wasn't a spring, wasn't a gusher, but it was steady. A hidden seam of water sitting somewhere below the surface that the dry summer and the hard-packed soil above it had kept buried. Tessa came running when she heard them talking. She leaned over the edge of the trench and looked down at the dark, wet ground and the small, thin trickle of water collecting at the base. "Water," she said. "Water," Brenna confirmed. Tessa sat down on the berm and looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I still have a spider?" Eli laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. The first real laugh Brenna had heard from him in months. She found herself laughing too, unexpectedly, crouched at the bottom of a muddy trench at the edge of the Nebraska prairie, with her children laughing beside her and water, a thin, stubborn, slow thread of water, working its way up through the ground she had not been willing to give up. They finished the trench on a Wednesday in the first week of June. Brenna stood at the northwest end of it and looked along its length. 180 yards of curved earthwork, the excavated berm running along its downhill edge, the trench itself now showing that faint dark moisture at the base where the underground seam was feeding it. It was not beautiful. It looked like what it was, a scar of raw earth cut by hand tools and stubbornness. She was behind on planting. Every conventional farming calendar said she had missed her window. Everyone in Ash Hollow who had an opinion about her shit, which was everyone in Ash Hollow, was waiting for her to confirm what they'd already decided. She planted anyway. Sorghum and winter wheat along the lower section of the property where the trench would direct captured water. Beans and corn in the section directly below the underground seam, which was continuing its slow, steady seep. She planted seeds that had no business going into ground this late in the season, in a drought year, on a piece of land that everyone had written off. She planted them, and she covered them, and she walked back to the soddy at the end of the day with her back hurting and her hands cracked and bleeding again, and the same thought she'd been carrying for weeks settled into something harder and quieter. She had done what she could do. The rest was the land's choice. That night, lying in the dark with Tessa curled against her back and Eli's breathing quiet across the room, Brenna thought about Thomas. Not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with a kind of wondering. She thought about his father Walter and the notebook and the correspondence with some man named Crane who had dug his own trench in Kansas and watched his neighbors starve while his crops stayed green. She thought about how knowledge moved across time, how it passed from hand to hand through letters and notebooks and conversations in kitchens, and how it sometimes sat waiting in an oilcloth-wrapped book at the bottom of a box that a woman grabbed without looking, running away from a house that was no longer hers. She was very tired. She slept. The seeds went in, and then there was nothing to do but wait and work and try not to count the days. June in Nebraska has a particular quality to it. The light comes in hard and flat from the west in the afternoons, and the wind carries enough grit to get into your teeth, and the sky is either the color of bleached bone or a deep bruised blue building toward a storm that may or may not arrive. Brenna had been watching the sky since she arrived. She'd gotten very good at reading it. So far, it had not given her much to work with. The trench sat in the earth like a long, dark seam. In the weeks after planning, she walked its length every morning, checking the moisture level at the base, watching the underground seam. The water came up slowly and steadily, just enough to keep the bottom of the trench dark. Not enough to irrigate with, not enough to flood, but enough to suggest that what Walter's notebook had promised might not be entirely a fantasy. Eli had started keeping a notebook of his own. She'd given him one of the blank books from the supply box, for a small thing with brown cardboard covers. And without being asked, he'd begun recording measurements. The depth of moisture in the trench at different points. The rainfall, when it came, which wasn't often. The date each crop row had been planted, the length of each row, the estimated seed count. He wrote in the small, careful hand of a boy who understood that the writing mattered. She didn't say anything about it. She just watched him doing it and felt something complicated move through her chest. Tessa, for her part, had decided that the trench belonged to her personally and had named it. She called it Gerald. "You can't name a trench," Eli told her. "I already did," she said. "His name is Gerald." "That's a terrible name for a trench." "Gerald is a very dignified name." Brenna stayed out of it. The mockery had settled into something steady by July. It wasn't mean-spirited exactly, or not always. It was the particular amusement of people who have already made up their minds and are now simply waiting for events to confirm them. When she went to town, she could feel it in the slight pauses in conversation, the looks passed between men at the feed store, the way Higgins always managed to work the word ditch into whatever he said to her, with just enough emphasis to make sure she heard the quotation marks around it. "Hear your ditch is coming along," he'd said in late June. "The trench, yes," she'd said. Right, the trench." He'd bagged her flour. "Carl Decker was saying you planted late, real late." "I did." "Sorghum and wheat, and corn and beans." He'd shaken his head in the specific way of a man who considers himself too polite to say what he actually thinks. "Brave," he'd said, which was not a compliment. She'd taken her flour. The harder conversation came from a man she hadn't expected it from. His name was Pete Alderman, and he farmed about 2 miles south. A good farmer by reputation, a man who'd been working Nebraska soil for 15 years and knew the conditions as well as anyone in the county. He stopped her one afternoon when she was driving home from town, pulling his horse alongside her wagon on the road. "Mrs. Holloway, got a minute?" She pulled Duncan to a stop. "I've got a minute." Alderman had a weathered, honest face, the kind that doesn't arrange itself well into false pleasantry. He looked at her straight. I'm not trying to be unkind, he said, but I've been farming this county a long time, and I feel like somebody ought to say this plainly. Go ahead. You planted a month late. This is a drought year. We all know it. Your soil hasn't been worked in 3 years. That trench might capture some water if we get rain, but we haven't gotten rain, and the long-range reading isn't good. He paused. I think you need to have an honest accounting of what you're facing before fall. You've got children. If the crop fails, you don't have time to recover before winter. She looked at him. The road was empty in both directions. The sky was that pale afternoon white. What are you suggesting? She asked. I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm saying you might want to think about options. Voss's offer is still open, I hear, and there are other homesteads, better watered ones. He told you to say that? Alderman's face shifted slightly. No, this is my own concern. I don't work for Voss. All right, she held his gaze. I appreciate you saying it straight. I'll say something straight back. I know what I'm facing. I've done the calculations more times than you can imagine. The trench is not a guess. It's based on documented technique from a man who farmed dry Kansas ground and produced crops through back-to-back drought summers. I planted late because the trench took as long as it took, and late planting is better than no planting. She paused. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I'm not operating on hope. I'm operating on a method. He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not conviction exactly, but the slight adjustment of a man revising an assessment. I hope you're right, he said. So do I, she said. Good day, Mr. Alderman. She drove on. The rain, when it finally came, arrived the wrong way. It was the 3rd week of July, a storm that built up over 2 days from the southwest, the kind that looked promising, and then, as sometimes happens on the plains, gathered itself into something angrier than promised. The sky went green-black in the late afternoon, and the wind shifted hard from the northwest, and by the time Brenna had gotten the children inside and the horse secured in the lean-to, the rain was coming down in sheets. She stood in the doorway of the soddy and watched it. The trench was out there in the dark somewhere, and she couldn't see it, could only hear the rain hammering the ground and the thunder rolling back and forth overhead. The sound of it was enormous. Is it good? Tessa asked from behind her. I don't know yet, Brenna said. It rained for 4 hours. Hard, sustained, the kind of rain that the ground doesn't absorb fast enough so it runs. When it finally slacked off past midnight, Brenna took the lantern and went out. The trench had water in it, a significant amount. It was perhaps a third full along most of its length, and near the northwest end, where the slope fed in strongest, it was nearly half full. The berm was holding. The curve was doing what Crane's note said it would do, slowing the water, spreading it evenly along the channel's length, rather than letting it rush to one end and overflow. She breathed out slowly. Then she walked to the southeast end of the trench, the lower end, and stopped. A section of the berm had given way. Perhaps 20 feet of the earthen wall on the downhill side had collapsed inward, and a good portion of the captured water had run out through the gap, cutting a channel down the slope toward the dry creek. The soil was soft from the rain, and the gap was ragged and still slightly crumbling at the edges. She stood there with the lantern held up, looking at it. 20 feet of lost berm, maybe a third of the captured water gone. The remaining 2/3 still sitting in the intact sections of the trench. She could see it, the dark water reflecting her lantern light. But the collapsed section would be a problem every time it rained. If the berm failed again on a heavy storm, she could lose everything in one night. She went back inside. She did not sleep. Eli found her at the table in the morning. The lantern burned down to almost nothing, Walter's notebook open in front of her alongside her own pages of calculations, and a rough sketch she'd been working on since somewhere around 3 in the morning. He looked at the sketch. He looked at her face. What happened? Part of the berm went, she said. About 20 feet southeast end. He sat down. How much water did we lose? Maybe a third. He was quiet a moment. Can we fix it? Rebuilding the berm the same way won't hold. The soil is too sandy in that section. It won't compact properly when wet. I've been thinking about a different approach. She turned the sketch toward him. Instead of trying to seal that end, we let it be the overflow point. Cut it deliberately. Control the break instead of fighting it. Build a short channel from the breakpoint that redirects the overflow water down to the low spot near the center of the property where it can pool rather than running off. Eli studied the sketch. So the overflow doesn't escape. It just goes somewhere useful. That's the idea. And the rest of the trench still holds. If we reinforce the berm on the intact sections, pack it with the heavier clay soil from the north end, yes. He looked at her. When did you figure this out? This morning, early. He looked at the burned-down lantern and didn't say anything about how early must have been. All right, he said. Show me where. They spent 3 days on the repair. It was in some ways harder than the original digging. The soil was saturated and heavy, and moving it was exhausting work. May Decker came by on the second day, took one look at what they were doing, and without a word picked up a spare spade and worked alongside them for 4 hours. Her husband Carl came to collect her in the late afternoon and stood at the edge of the property looking at the work with an unreadable expression. Carl? May said, in a tone that apparently conveyed a great deal between them. Carl picked up a spade. He didn't say much. He was a big, quiet man who worked efficiently. By the end of the day, the new overflow channel was roughed in. A shallow cut leading from the deliberate break in the berm down toward the low ground at the center of the property, where Brenna had already prepared a small catch basin. When the next rain came, the overflow would run down the channel and pool there rather than escaping off the property entirely. Carl straightened up and looked at the whole system, the long trench, the berm, the overflow channel, the catch basin. He looked at it for a long moment. He said. It was not enthusiastic, but coming from Carl Decker it was apparently high praise, because May caught Brenna's eye and gave her a small private nod. They ate supper together that evening. Beans and cornbread again. May had brought a pot, and it was the first time Brenna had sat at a table with other adults since arriving in Nebraska. Carl ate in his methodical way and didn't say much, but at one point Eli explained the overflow channel concept to him, the deliberate failure point, the redirected water. And Carl listened and then said, "That's not a bad thought," which made Eli sit up very slightly straighter in a way he probably didn't know he was doing. After the Deckers left, Brenna stood outside in the cooling night for a while. The catch basin already had some water in it from the rain 3 days before, fed down the new channel. It wasn't much, a few inches in a shallow depression the size of a large room, but it was water that would have been gone otherwise. Water that was now sitting here on her land, soaking down slowly through the soil. The trench sat silent in the dark. The berm held. August arrived, and with it a stillness that settlers on the plains learned to be afraid of. The wind died. That was the first sign. The constant Nebraska wind that pushed the grass and rattled the soddy door and carried the smell of distant rain. It simply stopped, one morning in the first week of August, as though the prairie had taken a breath and decided not to let it go. The sky went pale and high and absolutely still. The sun came down without mercy. By the second week, the temperature was hitting the mid-90s every afternoon, and the nights weren't giving it back. The grass on the open prairie, what was left of it from the spring dryness, began going brown. The Decker farm to the north started to show it first along the edges of their fields, the corn leaves curling slightly, the color changing from green to something yellower. Brenna watched it. She walked her own fields every morning and measured what she saw. Her crops were not thriving in any spectacular fashion. They were not lush or dramatic. They were not the stuff of agricultural stories. But they were alive. The sorghum along the upper field was shorter than it should have been at this stage, but the stalks were upright and the color was still good. The wheat had struggled more, some thinning at the edges, some patches that hadn't taken, but the bulk of it was hanging on. The corn and beans below the underground seam, where the moisture came up slow and steady, were doing the best. Still green, still growing. She heard the first well go dry on a Thursday. It was a farm 3 miles west, a man named Osterfeld who had a family of 6 and had been farming that ground for 8 years. The news came through May, who had heard it from someone in town. His well's down to mud, May said. She'd come over to check on things, which had become a regular occurrence. She was standing at Brenna's fence line, looking at the fields. He's hauling water from the river, but it's 3 miles. That won't last. Is he all right? For now, he's got some saved. May paused. His corn is gone, though, burned up last week. Brenna looked out at her own corn. Green. Still green. Carl's worried, May said, which was as close as she'd come to saying Carl's corn wasn't doing well. He won't say it, but I can see it. How bad? Upper field is bad. Lower field is holding, but it's close. May looked at Brenna's fields again. Yours is... She stopped. I don't understand it. I really don't. The moisture is still in the ground, Brenna said. That's all it is. The trench captured it before it could run off, and it's been releasing slowly. The plants are drawing it up from below. But we haven't had rain since that storm 3 weeks ago. No, but the ground still has what it caught. May was quiet for a moment, looking at the long curve of the trench berm across the midsection of Brenna's property. I laughed at it, she said. When Carl first told me what you were doing, I didn't say it to your face, but I laughed. I know. I'm sorry for that. Brenna looked at her. You also lent me your husband's mule and helped me dig the repair. That matters more than whether you laughed. May turned back to the fields. It's going to get worse. The drought. Everyone's saying so. I think so too. You don't have enough for everyone. Brenna didn't answer that. She was still turning the thought over, looking at it from different angles, trying to understand what she believed about it. She wasn't ready to say anything yet. The third week of August, Garrick Voss came back. She'd been expecting him. The drought had been building for weeks, and the mathematics of it were not difficult. As more farms failed and more wells dried up, the only green fields in the county became increasingly valuable, and Voss was a man who tracked value the way a hunting dog tracks scent. He rode in on a Tuesday afternoon, this time without the pretense of casualness. He came with a purpose, and he didn't bother disguising it. Mrs. Holloway, he said. He sat his horse at the edge of her fence and looked out at her fields with the open, assessing gaze of a man who has stopped pretending he isn't interested. That's a remarkable thing you've done. Thank you. I'll be honest with you. When I heard about the trench, I thought... He paused, and something almost like honesty crossed his face. I thought what most people thought. I know. I was wrong. He looked at her directly. The offer I made in April, I'm prepared to significantly increase it. The land isn't for sale. I'm not only talking about the land now. I'm talking about access to the water system, the trench, the spring seam, the catch basin. He named a number that was considerably larger than the first one. That's for the water rights and a usage agreement. You'd retain the land and the claim. She looked at him. The afternoon heat was sitting on everything, and her shirt was sticking to her back. Across the fence, her corn stood green and upright in a county where corn was dying. Why? She said. My herd, he said. I've got 4,000 head of cattle, and the South Creek is almost gone. I've been trucking water in, but that won't hold. I need a reliable source. He paused. You have one. And what happens to the families around here? The ones without cattle operations? Osterfeld and his 6 kids hauling water 3 miles because his well is mud? Something flickered in Voss's expression. That's not my concern. I know it isn't, Brenna said. She looked at him steadily. No. He was quiet for a moment. I'd think carefully about that answer. I have thought carefully about it. The answer is no. His expression didn't change much, but something behind it changed. A slight compression, a closing. I see, he said. Well, I hope you don't regret that. She watched him ride out. She stood at the fence line for a long time after he was gone, her hands resting on the top rail, looking out at her fields. The heat was merciless. In the distance, the Decker farm shimmered at the edges in the afternoon light, and beyond it the brown prairie rolled out flat and pale to the horizon. She turned and walked back to the house. Tessa was sitting in the doorway of the soddy with her bare feet in the dirt, doing something with a piece of string and a stick that Brenna couldn't quite identify as any recognizable game. She looked up as Brenna approached. Was that the man who wants to buy us? Tessa asked. He wants to buy the land, yes. Did you say no again? I did. Tessa went back to her string. Good, she said. Gerald belongs to us. Inside, Brenna found Eli at the table with his notebook. He'd been recording water measurements all morning, checking the trench, checking the catch basin, checking the moisture levels at various points in the fields. He had 2 weeks of daily measurements now, all of it in his careful hand. He looked up when she came in. Voss, he said. It wasn't a question. He offered for the water rights this time. Eli set down his pen. He knows the trench is working. He knows. He's got cattle dying. And you said no. I said no. Eli was quiet for a moment, looking at his notebook. What are we going to do then, with the water? People are going to start asking. She sat down across from him. I know. She put her hands flat on the table. I've been thinking about it. Thinking what exactly? She looked at her son. This serious, careful boy with his old man eyes and his notebook full of measurements, who had dug a trench alongside her for 6 weeks without complaint, and had not once asked her whether this was going to work, because he had decided to trust her the same way she had decided to trust the notebook. I'm thinking we don't sell it, she said, to Voss or anyone. I'm thinking that's not how it should go. Eli waited. This drought is going to get worse before it gets better. People are going to need water. Families around here. They laughed at the trench, but they are not bad people. They are just people who didn't know. She paused. I didn't know either until I found a notebook that someone I never met was smart enough to write. So what? Eli said. You just give it away? I open it, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had not come back. The afternoon sat silent and hot on the prairie, pressing down on every farm and field and family in the county. The catch basin held its few inches of captured rainwater. The trench was dark with moisture. 40 feet below the southeast end of it, a thin seam of water that had been sitting there unknown for years was still finding its slow way up. Eli picked up his pen. Then we're going to need more measurements, he said. We need to know exactly how much we have and how fast it replenishes, so we know what we can actually give. She nodded. He went back to his notebook. Eli's measurements told the story before anyone else was willing to say it out loud. He'd been recording twice a day now, morning and evening, checking the moisture levels at 5 different points along the trench, measuring the water depth in the catch basin with a marked stick, noting the color and texture of the soil in each crop section. 2 weeks of numbers filled in his careful hand, and the pattern they formed was not complicated. The underground seam was holding steady. The trench was releasing moisture into the soil at a slow, consistent rate. The catch basin had lost about an inch to evaporation over the past week, but the seam was compensating, feeding it back from below. We have enough for the crops through September, he told Brenna one evening, the notebook open on the table between them. Maybe into October if we don't get another hot stretch. And for sharing? He ran his finger down a column of numbers. Depends on how many people and how much they take. If it's a family coming once a week with barrels, we could handle maybe 6 or 7 families without pulling the system down. More than that and we start drawing the seam too fast. How do you know how fast the seam replenishes? I don't. Not exactly. He looked at her. That's the part we'd be guessing at. She looked at the numbers, 6 or 7 families. In a county where she already knew of 3 wells gone dry and 2 more failing. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough for everyone. But it was what they had, and what they had was more than nothing, and nothing was what most people around them were sitting with. We start with what we know, she said, and we watch the numbers. She went to see Osterfeld first. His farm was 3 miles west, and the road there told the story plainly. The grass on either side of it was burned to the root, the kind of brown that doesn't come back in the same season. A cow stood in a field with her ribs showing and her head down. The windmill at the Osterfeld place was turning but slowly, and when Brenna pulled up to the yard, she could see the bucket hanging from the pump arm was bone dry. Hans Osterfeld came out of the barn. He was a large man in his 40s, German-born, with a thick accent, and the kind of face that doesn't give much away. He looked at Brenna with mild surprise. They knew each other by sight from town, but had never spoken directly. Mrs. Holloway, he said. Mr. Osterfeld. I heard your well went. A pause. Pride moved across his face and then settled into something more tired. 2 weeks now. We're hauling from the river. I know, that's why I came. She told him about the trench, about the seam, about what the measurement showed. She told him plainly and without making anything sound larger than it was. I can't supply a river, she said, but I can give your family enough to get by, twice a week, if you can haul it. He was quiet for a long moment. A child appeared in the doorway of the house behind him. a girl about Tessa's age, watching with large eyes. "You'd do that," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I would." "Why?" She thought about it. "Because somebody wrote down what they knew and put it in a notebook, and I happened to find it. That's the only reason my fields are green right now and yours aren't. It could just as easily have been the other way." She paused. "So, twice a week, you bring barrels?" He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has been humbled enough by circumstances to accept help without making a production of it. "Thank you," he said. It came out rough, like the word cost him something. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me in October if the seam holds." Word moved the way it always moved in Ash Hollow, faster than she intended and in directions she hadn't anticipated. By the end of the first week of September, she had families coming she hadn't personally invited. A woman she'd never met, a Mrs. Beaumont, small and sharp-eyed, and about 60, showed up on a Wednesday morning with 2 teenage boys and a wagon loaded with empty barrels. She introduced herself briskly and explained that her well had been dry for 3 weeks, and her son's farm a mile north was the same, and she had heard from Osterfeld that Brenna Holloway was giving water, and she had come for some. Brenna looked at the barrels. She looked at the 2 boys, who were sweated and sunburned and looked like they hadn't slept well in some time. She looked at Mrs. Beaumont, who was looking back at her with an expression that was halfway between determination and the fragile alertness of someone who has been frightened for a while and is trying not to show it. "We can give you what the barrels hold," Brenna said. "I'll need you to sign your name in the ledger. I'm tracking what goes out." "Fine," Mrs. Beaumont said. "Where do I sign?" Eli brought the ledger. He had started it the day before, on his own initiative. A clean page in a new notebook, columns for name, date, quantity taken. He handed it to Mrs. Beaumont with a pencil. She signed without comment and handed it back, and then looked at him with sudden curiosity. "How old are you?" she said. "9, Eli said. "9, she repeated, looking at the ledger and then at him. "You made this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." She made a small sound that might have been approval and turned back to her barrels. Yet, they came with buckets and barrels and any container that would hold water. They came in the early morning and in the late afternoon when the worst of the heat had eased slightly. They came with their children and without their children. They came in silence and they came with too many words, the way people do when relief and embarrassment are mixed together in roughly equal proportions. Brenna watched Eli manage it. He had taken the ledger as his own project, standing at the trench access point each morning with his notebook, recording every name and quantity, explaining to each family what the limitations were, answering questions about the seam and the replenishment rate with the patience of someone twice his age. He wasn't performing it. He was just doing it, the way he did most things, methodically and without fuss. But she noticed that people talked to him, asked him things, listened to his answers. He had some quality. She had seen it in Thomas, too, though she hadn't named it until now, of being the kind of person that other people instinctively trust with information. The Deckers came on the 5th day, which surprised Brenna somewhat. Carl's farm was further along than she'd expected, or perhaps the drought had moved faster. He drove the wagon himself with May beside him, 2 large barrels in the back. He climbed down and walked to where Brenna was working a section of the berm that needed reinforcing. He stood there for a moment. "My lower field went," he said. "Last week." "I'm sorry, Carl." He looked at the trench and the catch basin and the crop fields behind them. He looked at them for a long, honest moment. "I told May in June you were wasting your time," he said. Said it in front of Eli. "I want you to know I was wrong." "You also dug the overflow channel repair with me," Brenna said. "That matters." "Doesn't change that I was wrong first." She looked at him. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But most people stay wrong rather than come back and say it, so." He made that same sound his wife made sometimes, a non-committal grunt that apparently served the Decker family as a general-purpose response to things that were true and uncomfortable. Then he nodded at the barrels. "Where do I put my name?" May was watching from the wagon. When Brenna caught her eye, May pressed her lips together in the particular expression of a woman who has been married long enough to find her husband's stubbornness both exasperating and endearing. "Ma'am." The last week of August had brought a small mercy of clouds, but no real rain. 3 days of overcast skies that lowered the temperature slightly before the sun came back. The catch basin had topped up a little from a brief shower on the 28th, less than an inch of rain that was almost insultingly inadequate, given what the county needed, but enough to keep Eli's replenishment calculations from going negative. The seam was the thing Brenna couldn't fully account for. It did what it did without regard for her schedule. Some mornings the water level at the southeast end of the trench was measurably higher than the morning before. The seam had pushed up a little more during the night. Other mornings it was static. It didn't follow a pattern she could predict with confidence, which meant Eli's numbers always had a margin of uncertainty built into them that neither of them talked about much because talking about it didn't help. What they did instead was watch and manage. And on the days when the numbers looked thin, Brenna went to whoever came for water and was honest with them. "We're watching the levels closely. Take a little less today. Come back Thursday." Most people understood. A few didn't or couldn't afford to, and those conversations were harder. A man named Rupert Hale came one afternoon. She'd seen him in town but didn't know him well. With a wagon loaded with so many barrels it made the axle creak. He was a big man, red-faced from the heat, with a specific kind of desperation that had curdled slightly into aggression. "I've got cattle," he said. "I need more than what that boy's been telling me." Eli was standing at the ledger point. He looked at the number of barrels and then at his notebook and said calmly, "The limit is 4 barrels per visit. That's what we can sustain." "I've got 20 head dying," Hale said. "I need 8. "I understand, but if we give 8 today, the seam pulls down and we can't give anything to the next 3 families. Hale looked past Eli to Brenna, who was standing near the trench. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm asking you directly." She walked over. "My son told you the answer. I'm asking you. And I'm telling you the same thing he told you. 4 barrels. Come back in 2 days and take 4 more. Hale's face went redder. "You know Voss offered you good money for this water. Good money. And you're standing here playing water warden?" 4 barrels, she said. "That's the offer. Take it or don't." He stared at her. She held his gaze without difficulty. She had been stared at by harder men in harder circumstances, and she had learned a specific thing about it, that the person who looks away first loses, and she was not going to look away. Hale took his 4 barrels and left without another word. Eli watched him go. "He's going to talk," he said quietly. "He already is," Brenna said. "That's fine. Talking doesn't bother me." What bothered her was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was starting to worry her. By the second week of September, they were serving 11 families on a rotating schedule. Eli's ledger showed a clean record of every visit and every amount taken, and the numbers at the bottom of each page showed the trench and seam levels trending slowly downward. Not catastrophically, not the kind of drop that meant crisis tomorrow, but a steady, gradual decline that, if it continued, would become a problem by mid-October. The seam wasn't replenishing as fast as the demand was drawing it down. She told Eli this on a Sunday evening. He already knew. It was his ledger, his measurements. But she told him anyway because she believed in saying things out loud rather than letting them sit unspoken in the room. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it." "Options?" He was quiet, looking at his numbers. "We could reduce the allotment per family, take it from 4 barrels to 3. That cuts into some families' minimum." "I know. Or we could reduce the number of families we're serving, turn some away." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I can't do that," Brenna said. "I know you can't." He paused. "There might be another option. The eastern end of the trench. It hasn't been dug as deep as the rest. If the seam runs further in that direction, we might hit a stronger vein." She looked at him. "That's more digging." "Yes." "In this heat?" "Yes." He met her eyes. "I know. But the numbers say we need more, not less, unless it rains." She looked out the window. The sky was the same pale, merciless white it had been for 3 weeks. There was no storm building in the west. There was nothing in the west except more of the same. "All right," she said. "We dig. Chop." They started the following Monday, extending the eastern end of the trench. The ground was harder here. It had been drier longer, the surface baked to a consistency that turned spade blades. Brenna worked mornings before the worst heat. Eli worked evenings. Tessa was assigned to keep them in water, which she did with great dedication and occasional commentary. "You're going to need a longer Gerald," she said one morning, watching them dig. "The trench is not named Gerald," Eli said, hitting a particularly solid shelf of dry clay and having to lean into it. "I named him Gerald." "You can't name a trench." "You've said that before. Gerald is still his name." Brenna dug without entering the argument. She was about 18 inches down in the new section, pushing through the dry layer toward whatever was below it. The work had a rhythm to it that she had learned to settle into. The lift and turn of the spade, the thud of hard earth hitting the pile, the particular ache that lived between her shoulder blades by mid-morning. She had muscles now that she hadn't had in April. Her hands were permanently rough. She did not think about this much. On the third day of extended digging, at a depth of about 2 feet, the soil changed. She felt it before she saw it. The spade went in differently, with less resistance, a slight give that meant the composition below had shifted. She crouched and pressed her hand into the bottom of the trench. Wet. Not the faint suggestion of moisture they'd found the first time. This was genuinely wet, the soil dark and heavy with it, and when she pushed her fingers down another inch, she felt the distinct cool of water rising to meet her. "Eli," she said. He was 8 feet away. He looked up. "Come here," she said. He walked over and looked down at where her hand was pressed into the dark earth. His expression shifted, a controlled thing, but she knew his face well enough to read what was under the control. "Bigger than the first seam?" he said. "I think so. The soil is wetter further in." She withdrew her hand and wiped it on her trousers. "Get the long spade." They dug for another hour. The seam opened up, or rather, the trench opened down into it, and the water that found the new channel was noticeably stronger than what the southeast end had been producing. It wasn't a gush or a fountain. It was still a slow feed, the patient upward movement of groundwater finding an exit, but it was measurably more. Tessa had climbed down from her perch on the old berm and was standing at the edge of the new section, looking at the dark, wet soil with her hands on her knees. "Gerald has a brother," she announced. Eli sat back on his heels in the trench and looked up at the sky. Brenna saw his throat move. He was 14 years old in that moment, and 9 years old, and 40 years old, all at the same time, and she had to look away before her face did something she didn't intend. "All right," she said, standing up. Her back screamed. "All right, let's measure it." The news that Brenna Holloway had hit a second water seam moved through Ash Hollow the way important news always moved there. Within 2 days, everyone knew, and within 4 days, the version that had reached the far end of the county bore only a loose relationship to what had actually happened. People were saying she'd drilled a well. People were saying she'd found an underground river. People were saying, and this was the version that irritated her most because it came back to her through May Decker with barely contained amusement, that she had used some kind of witching method from an old notebook, which was not entirely wrong in spirit, but was wrong enough in implication that she felt the need to correct it to anyone who repeated it in her presence. What it meant practically was this. The increased flow from the eastern extension changed the replenishment rate enough that Eli's numbers stabilized. Not abundantly, they were not sitting on an inexhaustible supply, but the slow downward trend in the ledger leveled off and held. They could sustain what they were giving without drawing the system into deficit, at least through the foreseeable future. The families kept coming. There were 16 of them now on the regular rotation. Eli's ledger had expanded to a third notebook page, the columns clean and precise. He knew every family's schedule, every barrel count, every variation. He had developed a system of notation she hadn't taught him, small marks that indicated whether a family had come on schedule or adjusted, whether there were unusual needs he'd accommodated, and why. It was the kind of record-keeping that would matter, she understood, in ways she couldn't fully see yet. Pete Alderman came on a Saturday in mid-September. He came without barrels, which meant he hadn't come for water. He'd come for something else. He stood at the fence and looked at the whole of the property with the same honest, direct gaze he'd used on the road when he'd warned her about her prospects in July. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You were honest with me," she said. "I don't hold that against anyone. I told you to consider selling to Voss, and I considered it and said no. That's how it's supposed to work." He was quiet a moment. "Your corn is better than mine," he said, "and I've been farming this county for 15 years. You've been farming dry. I captured what water there was before it ran off. Different problem, different approach. I know that now. He put his hands on the fence top. I want to understand it. The trench, the curved geometry, how you decided where to put it. He paused. Would you show me? She looked at him. You want to build one? Next spring, if we're still here. He said it simply, without drama, but the if carried a weight that she understood. The weight of a man calculating what another winter might do to savings already drained by a drought summer. I'll show you, she said. Come back when you have time, and I'll walk you through the whole system. The notebook, too, if you want to read it. I'd want to read it, he said. She nodded. They stood at the fence together for a moment, looking out at the county. The prairie was brown in every direction except where her field sat, and even hers were not lush or dramatic. They were just alive, which was enough, which was more than enough when alive was the thing that was hardest to be. How many families are you watering? Alderman asked. 16, regular. A few others occasional. He did the math visibly. You're keeping people on their land through this. Trying to. He looked at her. You know Voss isn't done. I know. He doesn't give up, Mrs. Holloway. He doesn't make one offer and walk away. He waits, and he finds the angle. She had already thought about this. She thought about it most nights in those quiet hours after the children were asleep, lying in the dark, listening to the stillness of the drought-held prairie, turning the shape of Garrick Voss's patience over in her mind. He had come twice. He had been refused twice. He had said, I hope you don't regret that, in the tone of a man who intends to arrange the regretting. I know, she said again. Alderman nodded once and pushed off the fence. Well, I'll come back for that walkthrough, and he paused. Thank you for what you're doing for the families here. Not everyone would. She didn't say anything to that. She watched him ride back toward the main road, and then she turned back to the fields and the trench and the slow, steady work of keeping something alive in a season that wanted everything dead. By the last week of September, the temperature finally began to ease. Not rain, still no real rain, but the brutal apex of the summer heat broke, and the mornings came in cool enough to remind people that the year had other seasons. The brown prairie stayed brown, and the dry wells stayed dry, and the livestock count in the county had dropped by an amount nobody was putting into official numbers yet because official numbers made things too real. But Brenna's field stood. The sorghum had reached something close to maturity, shorter than ideal, but viable. The wheat was thinner than she'd planned, but there was enough of it. The corn and beans below the eastern seam were the best of all, solid, upright, with the kind of density that said the roots had found what they needed and held on. She walked the fields in the evenings sometimes, just the act of walking them, feeling the soil under her boots, checking the moisture with her fingers, measuring by touch what the notebook had measured by theory. The trench sat in the earth like something that had always been there, like the land had been waiting for someone to cut that particular shape into it. One evening in late September, Tessa walked with her. They went the full length of the property, from the northwest corner down to the catch basin, and Tessa was quiet for most of it, which was unusual enough that Brenna kept glancing at her. Finally, Tessa said, Mama, do you think Papa knew? Brenna looked at her. Knew what? About the notebook, when he grabbed everything from the house. She thought about it. Thomas had grabbed that box in Moline in a hurry, in the last week before the bank came, throwing things in without stopping to look. He'd been sick already, though neither of them had known how sick. He'd been moving fast because he didn't have much time, and he knew it, even if he wasn't saying it. I don't think he knew what was in it, she said. I think he grabbed it because it was his father's. Tessa considered this. So it was an accident. Maybe. Or maybe he just knew to keep his father's things. Brenna looked at the trench running its long, patient curve across the slope of the land. The catch basin at the end of it held a few inches of dark water, the surface still in the evening air. The underground seam was down there somewhere in the dark earth, doing what it had always done, before any of them arrived, before any of them needed it. Maybe, she said again. They walked back to the house in the last light, and the sky to the west was the deep bruised color that sometimes meant weather building, and Brenna looked at it for a long moment before going inside. That night she lay awake listening, the way she had many nights before. But this time the sound she was listening for was different. She was listening for rain. She fell asleep listening, and in the morning she woke to the smell of it, the particular cold stone smell of rain on dry ground, and the sound of water on the soddy roof, and she lay still for one breath with her eyes open in the dark before she heard Tessa, across the room, say in a small, delighted voice, "Gerald is going to be so happy." The rain lasted 2 days. Not the violent storm kind. This was the other kind, the slow, steady kind that the plains get sometimes in early October. A gray blanket of cloud that sat down over the county and released itself gradually, the way a held breath releases. It wasn't enough to end the drought in any official sense. The creek bed east of Brenna's property dampened but didn't flow. The deeper wells stayed low. The soil drank what it could, and then the water sheeted off the surface of ground too long compacted to absorb fast enough. But the trench caught it. By the morning of the second day, the channel was running nearly full along most of its length, and the catch basin had risen by almost 8 inches. The overflow channel they'd rebuilt after the July collapse was working exactly as designed, the deliberate break in the berm releasing the excess in a controlled flow down to the low ground rather than bursting the whole system. Eli stood at the basin in the rain with his measuring stick and wrote numbers with the focused concentration of someone witnessing something they'd calculated but not yet seen. "Higher than I projected," he said. "Good, higher, or bad higher?" "Good." He looked up at her, rain dripping off his hat brim. The seam pressure increased too. The second one, the eastern extension. It's feeding in faster than it was yesterday. She looked at the dark water level in the basin. The rain is charging it from above. That's what I think. The rain soaks down to the seam, and the seam pushes up harder. He made a note. If it keeps doing this, even moderate rain, twice a month, we could sustain twice the current families through winter. She looked at him. He was soaked through and not bothered by it, pencil moving in his notebook, numbers going into columns. She thought about Thomas again. The way Thomas had said, "Well, let's figure it out about every problem, not as a platitude, but as a literal program, a movement from unknown to known through methodical work." "Twice the families," she said. "Maybe. The seam has to stay consistent." He closed the notebook and tucked it under his coat. "But yeah, maybe." She turned and looked out across the property. The fields were dark with rain and the sorghum stalks were bowing slightly under it. And beyond the fence, the prairie was brown and flat and stretching away to a horizon that had given up most of its color months ago. Somewhere in that flat brown distance, 16 families were collecting rainwater in buckets and praying the barrels they'd filled at her trench would last another week. "All right," she said. "We plan for more." Garrick Voss came back on a Friday in the third week of October. She had been half expecting him. The rain had been the thing that changed the calculation. Before the rain, he could afford to wait, watching her supply strain against demand, knowing the math would eventually turn against her. After the rain, with the basin refilled and the seam running strong, her position had solidified in a way that changed his timeline. He didn't come alone this time. He brought a man named Ferris, who was introduced as his land agent, a thin, precise man in a town suit who kept his hands folded in front of him and said very little but watched everything with the specific attentiveness of someone being paid to remember details. Voss sat his horse at her fence and looked at the operation. The families who had come that morning were just leaving, the Osterfeld boys with their full barrels heading back up the road, old Mrs. Beaumont's wagon turning north. He watched them go and then looked at Brenna. "You've built something real here," he said. There was something genuine in it, which she hadn't expected. It made her more cautious, not less. "I have," she said. "I want to make a serious offer, not the water rights alone. I want to propose a partnership. I put capital into expanding the system, more trench, more catch capacity. You manage the operation. We split the proceeds from water sales to the county." "I'm not selling water." He looked at her steadily. "You're giving it away." "I am. Mrs. Holloway?" He paused, and the patience in his voice was the patience of a man choosing his words with care. "What you're doing is admirable. I mean that. But it isn't sustainable as charity. Winter's coming. You have a harvest to manage, 2 children to feed, and you're running what amounts to a water operation for a third of the county at no return to yourself. At some point, the economics catch up." She looked at Ferris, who was looking at the trench. She looked back at Voss. "The harvest will cover us through winter. The water operation runs on what's already built. There's no ongoing cost that exceeds what I can manage. And next summer? If the drought continues? Then I'll deal with next summer. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he shifted in the saddle slightly. A small adjustment that meant something was changing in the direction of the conversation. I want to be straightforward with you, he said. I've had my land agent reviewing the original homestead claim documentation. He nodded toward Ferris without looking at him. There are questions about the improvement schedule. Under the terms of the Homestead Act, a claimant is required to demonstrate active cultivation and improvement of the land during the claim period. You spent the better part of 2 months digging in earthwork rather than planting or cultivating. That period is documented. A pause. There's an argument to be made that the claim was in technical default during those weeks. The air between them went very still. Brenna looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was flat and cold, and she could feel the temperature in it. Behind her, somewhere in the soddy, she could hear Tessa talking to herself in the particular narrative monologue she kept up when she played alone. You'd challenge the claim, Brenna said. Her voice was even. I'd prefer not to, Voss said. That's why I'm here making an offer first. That's why you're here making a threat with an offer attached to it. Something moved through his face. Not guilt. She didn't think Garrick Voss experienced guilt as a frequent guest, but perhaps a slight discomfort at having the structure of his position named plainly. I'm presenting you with options, he said. I see 3 options, she said. I sell to you, I partner with you, or you file a claim challenge and try to take the land through the courts. Those are your 3. Is that right? Ferris had gone still in a way that suggested he was very focused on something. That's a blunt reading of it, Voss said. I'm a blunt reader. She looked at him directly. Go ahead and file your challenge. I'll see you in court. Voss looked at her for a long moment, and in that look she could see the revision happening again. The same recategorization she'd seen in April, adjusting her from one type to another. He had come expecting negotiation. He had found a wall. Think carefully, he said. Court is expensive, time-consuming. You'd need representation. I'm aware of what court involves. He tipped his hat with a precision that conveyed nothing warm. Good day, Mrs. Holloway. He turned his horse, and Ferris followed, and they rode back down the road without looking back. Brenna stood at the fence until they were out of sight. Then she went inside and sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Eli was at the table already, ledger open, looking at her. I heard, he said. I know. What are we going to do? She sat with the question. What they were going to do depended on what she actually had. Not what she believed she had, not what she hoped, but what she could prove. What the paper record said about the period when they were digging instead of planting. Whether a court would look at 180 yards of earthwork designed to capture water and call it an improvement to the land, or call it a neglect of it. We're going to need help, she said. Eli looked at his ledger. Alderman, he said. Yes, and the families. And we're going to need someone who knows the law. She paused. Or can read it well enough to find out what it actually says. Pete Alderman came the next morning. She hadn't sent for him. Word had reached him already through the mechanism that moved all significant news in Ash Hollow, which was fast and comprehensive and not always accurate, but this time had been both. He sat at her table and she told him the exact shape of the threat. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about Alderman. He waited for the whole picture before responding. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Ferris is smart, he said finally. That's a smart angle. The question is whether it holds up to the actual statute. The Act talks about cultivation and improvement, and there's been some variance in how that gets interpreted. The trench is an improvement, Brenna said. You and I think so. A judge might see it differently. A judge who's never farmed dry ground might look at it and see 2 months of not planting. The trench is why the crops survived. Without it, there'd be nothing to show at all. I know that. You know that. He put his hands on his knees. Do you have records from the digging period? What you were doing, why, the method behind it? Eli kept a notebook, she said. Starting from the first day we broke ground on the trench. Dates, measurements, progress, the method. Alderman looked at Eli. Let me see it. Eli brought his first notebook from the shelf. The one from the trench period. The brown-covered book with its careful columns and daily records. He set it on the table, and Alderman opened it and read for a long time without speaking. His expression changed slowly as he read, a shifting from professional assessment to something more like genuine attention. He turned a page, then another. He looked at a spread of entries from the July period, the repair, the overflow channel redesign, the measurements before and after. You recorded the reasoning, he said. He was talking to Eli. Not just what you did. Why? Mama says you should always write why, Eli said, because numbers don't explain themselves. Alderman looked at Brenna. Something had settled in his face. This is evidence, he said. This is a documented record of deliberate agricultural improvement, ongoing and methodical, during the exact period Voss's agent is calling neglect. He tapped the notebook. A 9-year-old kept a better farm record than most adults I know. He'll be 10 in November, Tessa said from the corner, helpfully. Nobody acknowledged this. Will it be enough? Brenna asked. I don't know. It should be. But Voss has money, and I assume he'll find a lawyer with money, and that changes the weight of things. Alderman paused. You need someone in your corner who knows land claims. There's a man in Grand River, name of Hatch, Harold Hatch, who's handled homestead challenges before. He's not cheap, but he's thorough. How not cheap? Alderman named a number. It wasn't ruinous, but it was significant. A substantial portion of what the harvest would bring. Brenna looked at the table. She thought about the winter budget, the calculation she'd been running in her head since August, the narrow margin she'd been managing toward. Paying Hatch would mean the margin disappeared. There would be nothing left over. Any unexpected expense between now and spring would put her back in crisis. Can I have a day to think? She said. Of course, Alderman said. He closed Eli's notebook carefully and set it back on the table. But don't take too long. If Voss files, you want to be ready before he sets the terms. She didn't take a day. She took an evening, walking the property alone after supper while the children were inside, going the full length of the trench in the falling dark, watching the last light go out of the western sky. The basin was still high from the October rain. The seam was steady. The fields had been harvested through the week, and the yield, not spectacular, not a farmer's brag, but real and solid and more than enough, was stored in the lean-to and 2 rented bins in town. She had done what she came to do. The land was not dead. It had never been dead. It had just been dry. And dry was a problem with a solution if you were willing to look hard enough. She stood at the northwest end of the trench and looked down its length. In the dark, she couldn't see most of it, just the general shape of the berm and the faint glint of water at the basin end. But she knew it by memory now. Every section of it, where the clay was harder, where the curve tightened, where the soil changed color, where the eastern extension had opened into that second seam of dark, wet earth that had saved the calculation. She thought about Voss. She thought about his land agent and his suit and his folded hands, and the particular neatness of a threat delivered in the language of options. She thought about the 16 families in Eli's ledger. She thought about Osterfeld's daughter in the doorway with her large eyes, and Mrs. Beaumont, who signed the ledger without ceremony and called her son to fill the barrels. She thought about Carl Decker standing in the gap of the overflow repair with a spade he'd picked up without being asked. She thought about Walter Holloway, who had written things down because he believed knowledge mattered, and a man named Crane in Kansas who had dug a trench and written letters about it to a stranger. She went back inside. I'm going to fight it, she told Eli. He looked up from the notebook he was already updating. Today's measurements, today's entries. Hatch? Hatch. He nodded and went back to his writing. She rode to Grand River the following week and found Harold Hatch in a small office above the dry goods store on the main street. He was a compact man of perhaps 55, bald except for a fringe above his ears, with the particular manner of lawyers who have spent decades reading fine print, careful, unhurried, tending toward silence until he had something worth saying. He read through everything she brought. Eli's notebooks, all 4 of them now, the trench records and the water ledger. Walter's notebook and the Crane correspondence section. The original claim documentation. He read without expression for nearly an hour while Brenna sat across the desk and waited. Finally, he set it all down. The Homestead Act requires cultivation and improvement, he said. The standard interpretation of improvement includes any modification to the land that increases its agricultural value or productive capacity. He paused. A water capture system that turned unproductive dry ground into viable farmland is, by any reasonable reading, an improvement. The question is whether the period of construction, before planting, represents abandonment or preparation. It was preparation, Brenna said. I agree. And this, he tapped Eli's first notebook, makes that argument very well. The records are dated, detailed, and demonstrate a continuous agricultural intention throughout the construction period. He paused again. Where did the boy learn to keep records like this? His mother tells him to write down why, Brenna said. Hatch made a sound that in a less composed man would have been a laugh. Voss's challenge rests on the argument that non-planting equals non-improvement. We rebut that by showing the construction period was itself an act of agricultural improvement, documented in real time. It's a sound argument. He looked at her. It's not a guaranteed win. Judges have latitude, but it's sound. She told him his fee. He confirmed it. She paid a portion as a retainer from the envelope she'd brought, and they shook hands. One more thing, she said before she left. The water. I've been giving it to families in the county. 16 families, tracked in the ledger. Does that create any problem for the claim? Hatch looked at her. Does it generate income? No. Then it's use of the land's resources, not a transfer of rights. It actually helps. It demonstrates active engagement with the property and its output. He paused. Your giving the water away might be the clearest evidence you're not neglecting the land. You're using it so actively you're supplying a third of the county. She walked out into the Grand River Street and stood for a moment in the October wind, which was coming in from the north now with the first real cold in it. She had money enough for a careful winter. She had a lawyer who believed the argument was sound. She had a son with 4 notebooks full of evidence. She got back on her horse and rode home. The news of the coming legal challenge reached Ash Hollow ahead of her, which she should have expected. By the time she got back, May Decker was already at her fence, an alderman was standing in the yard, and Osterfeld had driven over in his wagon with his oldest son. She pulled up and looked at them. Word travels, she said. It does, May said. What do you need? She looked at them. This collection of people who had laughed at the ditch and come for water and dug repairs and signed ledgers and shown up in their imperfect and complicated and human way when the circumstances required it. Letters, she said. Anyone who's used the water and knows what this operation is, what it does, what it's for. Write it down, what you saw, what you know. Give it to Eli. He'll keep it with the records. Osterfeld nodded immediately. I'll write it tonight. Carl will write one, May said. I'll make sure of it. Alderman was already thinking ahead. She could see it in his face. I'll talk to some of the other farmers, the ones who came to you for water, the ones who watched the construction. Voss wants to paint this as neglect. We give the court a picture of what this land actually is and what it's done for this county. Brenna climbed down from her horse. Her back ached from the ride, and she was cold and tired, and there was supper to make, and Tessa was going to want to hear every detail of the Grand River trip, and Eli would want to see the retainer receipt and add it to whatever column he kept for financial records. Thank you, she said. All of you. Don't thank us, Osterfeld said. He said it in the same tone she'd used with him in September when he'd tried to thank her for the water. She recognized it and almost smiled. The letters came in over the following 2 weeks. 11 of them, eventually. Some short, some long, some barely legible and clearly written by people for whom writing was a serious undertaking. They said the same things in different words, what the trench was, when it was built, what it had done for their families during the drought. Osterfeld's letter was 3 paragraphs in careful German-inflected English, plain and factual. Mrs. Beaumont's was 1 paragraph, but dense with specifics. Carl Decker's was 4 sentences and somehow conveyed everything necessary. Eli filed them in a folder he'd made from stiff brown paper, labeled in his handwriting. Community Statement. Holloway Water Claim, 1887. He set it next to the notebooks on the shelf. Garrick Voss filed his legal challenge on the 4th of November. Brenna was in town when it happened. She saw Ferris coming out of the courthouse office with his careful, neutral face and understood immediately what it meant. He saw her too. He didn't stop. She went home and told the children. Tessa listened to the explanation with her chin in her hands. When Brenna finished, she was quiet for a moment. So somebody's going to decide if Gerald is legal, she said. Something like that, Brenna said. Tessa thought about this. Gerald's been giving water to everybody, she said. The judge should know that. He will, Eli said. He was already at the table with the folder open, reviewing the contents. I'll make sure of it. Tessa seemed satisfied by this. She slid off her chair and went back to whatever she'd been doing before, and Brenna looked at her son, at the folder and the notebooks and the care that sat in the set of his shoulders, and thought that Thomas had left her more than a piece of land. Outside, the November wind was cold and direct, and the prairie had gone the uniform pale brown of a season ending. The trench was still in the earth, dark with the last of the October rain. The basin held water. The seam ran on, patient and underground, doing what it had been doing long before any of them arrived, and would continue doing long after the courthouse made whatever decision it was going to make. The hearing was set for December. The courthouse in Grand River was a 2-story brick building that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, and on the morning of the hearing it was cold enough that Brenna could see her breath in the entryway before the stoves got the interior up to temperature. She had driven in the night before with the children and stayed at the only boarding house in town, a narrow place run by a woman named Mrs. Cord, who fed them a solid supper and asked no questions, which Brenna appreciated. Eli had spent most of the evening reviewing the notebooks again. Not because anything in them had changed, but because that was how he managed anxiety, by returning to the things he knew were true. Tessa had fallen asleep before 8, one arm flung over the edge of the bed, mouth slightly open, as untroubled as if tomorrow were an ordinary day. Brenna had not slept much. She sat at the small desk in their room after the children were asleep and read through Walter's notebook one more time. Not the crane section, not the farming method. She had those memorized by now. She read the early pages, the ordinary ones, the planting records from Missouri, the weather notes from the Illinois years, a passage near the front of the book where Walter had written, in the slightly stiff hand of a man not accustomed to expressing things directly, "The land does not owe you anything, but it will answer if you ask the right question." She closed the notebook and put it in the satchel with the others. Harold Hatch met them at the courthouse door at 8 o'clock. He had the composed, unhurried manner she'd seen in his office, but there was something else in it today, a sharpening, a quality of readiness that she found reassuring. "Voss's lawyer is a man named Caldwell," he told her, standing in the entryway while people moved around them. "He's handled land cases before. He's going to argue straight from the statute, cultivation requirements, planting timeline, the weeks of non-agricultural activity." "The trench is agricultural," Brenna said. "We say so. He says otherwise. The judge decides." Hatch looked at her steadily. "Judge's name is Orrin Presley. He's been on the bench 12 years. He's thorough, and he doesn't like being talked down to by either side. Tell the truth. Answer what's asked. Don't embellish. Let the records speak." "The records are good," Brenna said. "They are." He paused. "The letters from the families are also good. I submitted them yesterday. Caldwell objected, but Presley allowed them." A slight, precise pause. "The boy." She looked at him. "Eli. He kept the primary records during the critical period. I'd like him to present them to the court. Not testify formally. He's a minor, but present the notebooks, explain his system, answer Presley's questions if the judge has any." He watched her face. "It's his work. He should stand behind it." She thought about Eli at the desk in the boarding house room, going through the notebooks one more time. She thought about him at the trench every morning with his measuring stick, at the ledger with his pencil, explaining the system to families who came for water with the patience of someone who understood that explaining things well was its own form of responsibility. "He'll do it," she said. "I know he will," Hatch said. "I'm asking if you'll allow it." "Yes," she said. About. The hearing room held perhaps 40 people, and it was full. That surprised her. She had expected Voss, his lawyer, herself, Hatch, and whatever witnesses each side had arranged. She had not expected the room to be full of people from Ash Hollow and the surrounding county who had apparently made the drive to Grand River on a cold December morning to be present for a land claim hearing. She recognized faces: Alderman in the second row, the Deckers beside him, Osterfeld with his wife and eldest son, Mrs. Beaumont in a good dress, Higgins from the feed store looking slightly uncomfortable at having no clear side to position himself on. She did not let herself react to it. She walked to the plaintiff's table with Hatch and sat down and looked straight ahead. Garrick Voss sat at the other table with Caldwell. He was dressed well, composed, and he did not look at her when she entered, which told her the composure was deliberate. Judge Presley came in at 9 o'clock exactly. He was a tall, dry man of 60 with reading glasses and the expression of someone who has heard many cases and found most of them less complicated than the parties involved believed. He settled himself, reviewed the documents in front of him for a moment, and then looked up. This is a claim challenge filed by Garrick Voss against Brenna Holloway regarding the Holloway homestead claim, 120 acres, filed under the Homestead Act of 1862. He set the papers down. Mr. Caldwell, you're challenging on grounds of improvement default. Proceed. Caldwell was smooth and measured. He laid out the argument cleanly. The statute required active cultivation. The claimant had spent the primary planting window of the first season, April through early June, engaged in earth-moving rather than agricultural activity. The planting that eventually occurred was delayed beyond the viable window for the region, and the resulting harvest, such as it was, did not demonstrate the level of agricultural development required to support a full claim. He was good at his job. Brenna watched the judge's face while Caldwell spoke and could read nothing from it. Then Hatch stood up. He did not go after Caldwell's points one by one. He started somewhere else entirely. Your Honor, the question before this court is what the word improvement means under the statute. Mr. Caldwell defines it as planting. I would suggest the definition is broader and more honest than that. That improvement means any deliberate modification of land that increases its agricultural capacity and productive value. And I would like to show the court exactly what modification was made to the Holloway claim during the period Mr. Caldwell calls a default. He introduced the notebooks. He introduced Walter's notebook and the Crane correspondence. He introduced the community letters. He did it methodically, without theatrics, and then he said, the primary record of the construction period was kept by the claimant's son, Elias Holloway, who is 9 years old and present in this courtroom. With the court's permission, I'd like him to present his records directly. Presley looked at Eli over his reading glasses. He looked at him for a moment. How old did you say? 9, Your Honor, Hatch said. Presley looked at Eli again. Come up here, son. What? Eli carried his notebooks to the front of the room. He stood there without fidgeting, which Brenna knew was not the absence of nerves, but the management of them. He had Thomas's quality in this too, the ability to be afraid without showing it in his hands or his feet. He set the notebooks on the edge of the judge's bench, opened the first one, and looked at Presley. This is the record from April 14th through June 3rd, he said. That's the period when we were building the trench. Every day I recorded the date, the section of trench we worked, how far we got, the depth, and what the soil was like. I also recorded why we were doing each thing. Presley looked at the notebook. He turned a page. He turned another. Why did you record the reasoning? My mother says numbers don't explain themselves, Eli said. If you just write down Doug's 6 feet, someone reading it later doesn't know if that was good or bad or what it was for. So I wrote down what we were trying to do and why we thought it would work. Presley looked at him for a moment. Show me an entry. Eli found the page from May 3rd, the day they'd realized the southeast berm section was going to need a different approach. And read the entry, the date, the measurement, the observation about the soil composition in that section, the note. Berm and SE section may not compact properly when wet. Sandy substrate. Consider deliberate overflow point rather than reinforced closure. Would redirect excess rather than lose it. That's your writing? Presley said. Yes, sir. From May 3rd. Yes, sir. Presley looked at the entry. He looked at it long enough that the room had gone completely quiet. And the overflow point you reference here? That's the channel that redirected the stormwater in July? Yes, sir. We built it after the first storm, when that section did fail the way I was worried it might. But because we'd planned for it, we were able to cut the overflow deliberately and direct it to the catch basin instead of losing it. Presley turned another page. What's this column? The one marked SE? That's the seam measurement at the southeast end, the underground water seam. I measured it every morning and evening to track how fast it replenished after we took water out. You discovered the seam during construction? Yes, sir. We hit it when we were digging the trench deep. It started feeding into the channel from below. Eli paused. That's in the April record, around the 20th. I can find it. I'll find it, Presley said. He was already turning back. Caldwell stood. Your Honor, with respect, the testimony of a 9-year-old regarding his own family's records. Sit down, Mr. Caldwell, Presley said, without looking up from the notebook. I'm looking at the records. I don't need your commentary on them. Caldwell sat. Presley read for several minutes. The room stayed quiet. Brenna looked straight ahead and kept her hands still in her lap. Beside her, Hatch sat with the patience of a man who has done his work and knows the outcome is no longer in his hands. Finally, Presley set the notebook down and looked at Eli. You tracked 16 families in this ledger, he said, holding up the water record. Yes, sir, 17 now. Mrs. Pollard started coming in November. And none of them paid for the water. No, sir. Why not? Eli looked at him. Because we didn't need payment. We needed people to stay on their land. He paused, and something came into his face that was 9 years old and very old at the same time. If we'd sold it, only the ones with money would have gotten through the summer. The ones without money would have lost everything and left, and then there'd be nobody here. The room was very still. Presley looked at Eli for a long moment. Then he looked at Brenna. Then he looked at the notebook stacked on the edge of his bench. Mr. Caldwell, he said, does your client wish to speak to any of this? Caldwell leaned toward Voss. There was a brief, quiet exchange. Then Caldwell stood. We stand by the filing, Your Honor. The statute is clear about cultivation requirements. The statute, Presley said, uses the word improvement, not the word planting. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the bench. I have before me 4 notebooks of contemporaneous records, beginning on the first day of construction and running through the end of the growing season, documenting in daily detail a deliberate, methodical modification of previously unproductive land that resulted in a functioning water capture agricultural system. I have 11 letters from county residents attesting to the system's contribution to their survival during a drought that destroyed crops across this county. I have a harvest record demonstrating viable production from ground that had produced nothing in 3 years. He paused. I have no doubt whatsoever that this land was being actively improved during the period in question. Digging a water system is not abandoning land. It is, by any honest definition, improving it. He put his glasses back on. Claim challenge denied. The Holloway homestead claim stands. Cost to the challenger. He picked up the next file on his desk. It was done. Asim. The room shifted and some people made sounds, and Hatch said something to Brenna in a low professional voice that she didn't entirely hear because there was a roaring in her ears that wasn't quite sound, the particular pressure of relief hitting a body that has been braced against something for a very long time. Eli was still standing at the front of the room. She looked at him. He was looking back at her, and his face had done what it almost never did. It had given up the control entirely, just for a moment, and what was underneath it was his age. She stood up and went to him and put her hand on his shoulder, and that was all. Just her hand on his shoulder, and he stood up a little straighter under it and then composed himself again. Tessa, who had been sitting behind them in the gallery next to May Decker and had been admirably silent for nearly 2 hours, now stood on the bench seat and said in a voice that carried clearly across the room, Gerald wins. May Decker put her hand over her mouth. Carl Decker's shoulders shook. Somewhere in the room, someone laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine, and then more of them, not cruel, the kind of laughter that happens when tension breaks and the room remembers it's made of people. Garrick Voss walked out without looking at anyone. Set. Caldwell stopped Hatch in the entryway on the way out. Brenna was close enough to hear. The boy was the move, Caldwell said. He didn't say it with bitterness exactly, more with the professional recognition of an opposing lawyer identifying what had decided a case. Presley's a practical man. Put the actual records in front of him and he doesn't need anything else. It wasn't a move, Hatch said. It was the truth. Caldwell looked at him and then at Brenna. Either way, he said, and walked out. She watched him go. She thought about Voss's face as he left the room. Not angry, exactly. Closed. The expression of a man recalculating, putting things away, moving to whatever came next. She had won this, but she didn't believe for a moment that it was the last she'd hear from Garrick Voss in her life. Men like Voss didn't disappear. They waited and found other angles and worked other levers. She had beaten this version of his challenge. The county had made clear through 11 letters and a room full of people on a cold December morning what they thought of the attempt. That mattered. That changed the calculation in ways that legal victories alone didn't. She collected her children and her notebooks and walked out into the December cold. Alderman was waiting outside with the Deckers and Osterfeld. They stood in the cold without ceremony, which was how she had come to understand the people of this county expressed most of the things they felt strongly about. "Well?" Alderman said. "Well," she agreed. Carl Decker looked at Eli. "Good work," he said. 4 words. Coming from Carl, it landed the way a longer speech would have from someone else. Eli nodded. He had his notebooks under his arm, all 4 of them, pressed against his coat. Osterfeld shook her hand, both hands actually, covering hers with his 2 large ones in the way of his people, brief and warm. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. May hugged her, which surprised Brenna and also didn't. May had been surprising her since the day she showed up with covered beans and an offer of a mule. That was the thing about May. She did the right thing before she finished deciding whether she felt like it, which was the most reliable version of goodness Brenna had encountered. They drove home in the cold, the 3 of them. Duncan, the old horse steady on the winter road as always, the sky flat and gray above the brown prairie. Tessa sat between Brenna and Eli on the bench and narrated the journey in the way she narrated everything. A running account of observations about the landscape, the horses they passed, a hawk sitting on a fence post, the color of the frozen creek bed. Eli was quiet for most of the drive. He had the notebooks in his lap and one hand resting on top of them, and he was looking at the road ahead. About halfway home, he said, "What happens now?" "With the claim? It stands. Voss can't come at it the same way again." "I don't mean with the claim." He turned and looked at her. "With the water, with the families, with the trench." She thought about it. The prairie was going into winter and the water needs would ease for a few months. People didn't need irrigation water when the ground was frozen, and the drought's worst effects were behind them at least until spring. But spring would come, and next summer might be dry again, and the families in Eli's ledger would be back. "We keep doing what we've been doing," she said. "Alderman wants to build his own system in spring. I told him I'd walk him through it. He told me he wants to read the Crane correspondence," Eli said. "I said I'd copy it out for him." She looked at him. "When did you talk to Alderman about that?" "This morning, before the hearing." He shifted the notebooks in his lap. "I was thinking, if Alderman builds one and it works, and he shows his neighbor, and that neighbor builds one, the knowledge moves," Brenna said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what happened with us. Walter wrote it down, Crane wrote it down. It ended up in your box. And now we have water when everyone else doesn't." He paused. "If we don't pass it on, it stops here." She looked at her son. He was 9 years old, nearly 10, and he had just presented evidence to a county court and helped save a homestead claim and was now thinking about the propagation of agricultural knowledge across the Nebraska plains. She thought about the person he was going to be, and the thought was not entirely comfortable, because people who thought the way Eli thought tended to take on more than was easy and care about more than was convenient, and spend their lives doing things that mattered more than things that paid. She thought about Thomas, and she thought, yes, exactly like that. "We'll copy the Crane section," she said, "Mama. All of it, measurements and all. Anyone who wants it can have it." Eli nodded and looked back at the road, and that was the end of the conversation, which was the Holloway way of settling things. Winter came down hard in January. The ground froze solid, and the wind came off the northern plains with the particular meanness of a Nebraska January, finding every gap in the soddy walls and the lean-to slats. Duncan the horse grew a thick winter coat and stood in the lean-to with his blanket and his opinions. The trench filled with snow and the catch basin iced over in a skin of gray-white that Tessa tried to walk on and broke through and came back to the soddy with wet boots and the expression of someone who had learned something but was not prepared to admit it directly. Brenna spent January and February doing what she hadn't had time for since April, reading, thinking, planning. She read through the Crane section again with the specific purpose of understanding not just what he'd done but why certain angles worked better than others, why the curve had to be calibrated to the slope gradient, what the theory behind the soil berm construction was. She had built the system from Crane's instructions the first time. Now she was trying to understand it well enough to teach it. She wrote her own notes. Not in Walter's notebook, she left those pages as they were, but in a new book, filling in the details that Crane had assumed his reader knew, adding the specific observations from her own construction, the soil composition notes from Eli's records, the seam discovery, and what she thought it implied about reading ground moisture before you dug. Eli read it when she was done and made corrections to 2 of her slope measurements, citing his own notes. She corrected them. "You should put your name on it," he said, setting the book down. "Crane didn't put his name on his letters to Walter," she said. "He just told what he knew. Crane was writing to one person. You're going to give this to people who don't know you. They should know who figured it out." She thought about this. "We both figured it out," she said. "Your name goes on it too." He looked at the book. Then he took the pen and wrote on the inside cover in his careful hand. B. Holloway and E. Holloway, Ash Hollow, Nebraska, 1887. Alderman broke ground on his trench in April of 1888, the same week that Brenna planted her second season. On time this time, the ground already moistened from the spring melt filling the replenished basin and the seam running strong from winter snowpack soaking down. She walked his property with him twice before he dug, the way she had walked her own, reading the slope, identifying the drainage patterns, finding the right line for the curve. He built it in 3 weeks with his 2 adult sons, who were large men and moved a great deal of dirt quickly. When it was done, he stood at the northwest end of it and looked at it the way she had stood at the end of her own, that first time, seeing it whole. He said, which Brenna had come to understand was the county's default expression of genuine satisfaction. By the end of the summer of 1888, which was, again, a dry year, though not as brutal as 1887, 3 other farms in the county had built water capture systems based on the Holloway design. They were not identical to hers. Each farmer had adapted the specifics to their own slope and soil. One of them, a young farmer named Driscoll, who had arrived from Ohio the previous fall with more enthusiasm than experience, had read the notes Eli had copied out and then written back with 2 questions that Eli answered in letters that were notably more thorough and precise than most letters written by 10-year-olds. The summer after that, 5 more farms. The summer after that, the County Agricultural Extension sent a man out from Lincoln to look at what was happening in the Ash Hollow area, where crop survival rates during dry summers had been noticeably higher than surrounding counties. He came with a notebook of his own and spent a week talking to farmers, and then he talked to Brenna. She showed him the whole system: the trench, the berm, the overflow channel, the catch basin, the eastern extension, and the second seam. She showed him Eli's original records. Eli was 12 by then and had started a new ledger for the second season, and the third, each one more precise than the last, and she showed him her own written notes, the ones with both their names on the inside cover. The extension man's name was Garber, and he was a careful, serious person who wrote everything down and asked good questions and didn't pretend to understand things he didn't. "Who developed the original method?" he asked. "A man named Crane," she said. "Kansas. I don't know his first name. He corresponded with my father-in-law." She paused. "Walter built on what other people knew before him. Crane built on what people knew before him. I built on what they wrote down. My son built on what I knew." She looked at the trench. "That's how it works." Garber wrote this down. He looked at the trench for a long moment. "You know this is going to be in the extension report." "I figured. You understand what that means. This goes to every county in western Nebraska, probably further." She had thought about this. Not with pride exactly. It wasn't pride she felt when she thought about it. It was something harder to name, something closer to the satisfaction of a circuit completing. "That's good," she said. "That's the point." 5 years after she arrived on that cracked, dry, apparently hopeless piece of ground, with 2 children and a horse with opinions, Brenna Holloway stood at the northwest end of the trench on an October evening and looked down its length. It was not the same trench she had dug in 1887. It had been extended and modified and improved in the years since. A longer eastern arm, a second catch basin, reinforced sections of berm where the original clay had slowly eroded. It had grown the way useful things grow when people pay attention to them. Eli's current ledger, he was on his 7th notebook now, showed measurements going back to the first day, a continuous record of what the land held and released and replenished season after season. Tessa was 14 and had grown into a person of strong opinions and moderate patience, who had inherited Brenna's directness and Thomas's stubbornness in roughly equal and occasionally exhausting measure. She still called the trench Gerald. She had never wavered on this point. Eli was 14 going on 40. He corresponded with 6 farmers across 3 counties, answering questions about water capture systems with the same thoroughness he'd brought to explaining the ledger to families who came for water in the drought summer. He was going to be something. She didn't know exactly what, only that it would involve thinking carefully about problems and writing down why. The county looked different than it had in 1887. Not dramatically different. It was still the plains, still the same flat brown distance and enormous sky, still the same hard-working, isolated communities strung along the roads and railways. But the farms that had been in danger of failing in the drought year had mostly survived. The families in Eli's ledger were still there, still on their land, and several of them had built their own systems. The knowledge was moving outward the way knowledge moves when it's written down and shared freely, slow but persistent, finding its way to whoever needed it. Garrick Voss was still in the county. She had seen him twice since the hearing, once in town, once on the road, and each time he had been civil and distant in the way of a man who has reassigned someone from the category of problem to the category of fact. He had not approached her again. His cattle operation had contracted somewhat. The drought year had cost him more than he'd projected, and he was, by the reports that moved through Ash Hollow, focused on recovering that ground. He had not, as far as she knew, thought about her property since December of 1887. She did not spend time thinking about Garrick Voss. She had more interesting things to think about. She crouched at the trench edge and pressed her hand into the soil, moist, dark. The seam was still there, still doing what it did, the slow, patient upward movement of water through ground that had held it long before she arrived and would hold it long after she was gone. She thought about what it meant. Not the legal part, not the winning, but the actual fact of it. That she had come to ground everyone said was dead and found that it wasn't. That the water had been there the whole time, underground, waiting for someone to ask the right question. That the right question had come to her through a chain of people who wrote things down. Crane to Walter, Walter to Thomas, Thomas to her to Eli, Eli to Driscoll, and out from there to wherever it went. That was the thing she had come to believe in the years since the drought summer. Not that she was exceptional, not that she had done something no one else could have done, but that the difference between a dead farm and a living one, between a family that stayed and a family that left, between ground that fed people and ground that didn't, was often not the ground itself. It was knowledge, and knowledge was only knowledge if it moved. She stood up. The evening light was doing what it did in October, coming in at that low flat angle that turned everything amber and long-shadowed, the trench running its curve across the property like a signature, the basin at the end holding its dark water still. Behind her, from the soddy, she could hear Tessa arguing a point with Eli in the specific, unrelenting way Tessa argued all points, and Eli's patient, measured responses, and underneath both their voices the sound of supper being made, which was her cue. She took one more look at the trench. It was not beautiful. It had never been beautiful. It was a scar in the earth made by hand tools and stubbornness, repaired once in a rainstorm and extended once in desperation, and improved gradually by the accumulated understanding of what worked and what didn't. It was muddy in spring and dry at the edges in summer and filled with snow in winter, and it smelled of mineral earth and deep water and the particular good smell of ground that is alive. 5 years ago, she had stood in the same place and looked at cracked dry land and done the arithmetic of survival and decided to pick up a shovel. She had not known then whether it would work. She had not been brave exactly. Bravery implies a choice, and she had not felt she had many choices. She had been stubborn, and she had been paying attention, and she had found a notebook at the bottom of a box. That was all, and it had been enough. She turned and walked back to the house, to the sound of her children arguing about something that probably didn't matter, in a home on land that was hers, on ground that held water, on a prairie that was slowly learning, farm by farm, notebook by notebook, season by season, how to answer back.